Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP's Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. A lot to cover today, as ever. Let's start with a Tatarigami piece here, or thread, on the trade-off between high-cost equipment and low-cost equipment and effectiveness, so on and so forth. As this war has now extended beyond a year and a half, the issue of cost efficiency becomes even more important. Using the illustration of a Russian logistical facility located in Yakimivka, Zaporizhia Oblast, I will explain this challenge in a straightforward manner. This is something has been mentioned plenty of times. I know Trentelenko talks about this. I know plenty of people say, look, if we had these types of weapons, we could absolutely obliterate Russian logistics chains here, and here. It just seems to be out of range of HIMARS, in range of cruise missiles, but then it's just slightly too small for a cruise missile, so we need something else. Anyway, it goes on. Since 2022, this logistical node has operated as a Russian vehicle repair facility, primarily focusing on armored vehicles. Through a comparative analysis of imagery, it becomes evident that the facility is operational, although its capacity remains somewhat limited. So you can see there a place with a whole bunch of Russian military vehicles outside, a bit of a kind of scrapyard repair place, so on and so forth. This leads to the subsequent question: can we dismiss a facility as insignificant in terms of targeting? Simultaneously, is it truly justifiable to deploy $2 to $3 million Storm Shadow missiles, limited in supply, against a relatively basic repair shop setup? The present dilemma, wherein the target is too small to warrant the use of costly weaponry, yet too significant to be disregarded, underscores the lack of scale of cost-efficient resolutions for each scenarios at this moment. For such scenarios at this moment, you've got tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that are not only stored there, waiting to be repaired. Some of them may have already been repaired. You've got tanks as well down there. So you've got lots of high-value equipment, or it's maybe not high value yet, but it's potentially high value once it's repaired. So if you take this out, arguably this then stops. I don't know. Not only are you going to destroy those pieces so they cannot be repaired if you do a good job on this. So imagine a couple of HIMARS here, 2 or 3 HIMARS, maybe a few GLSDB, so on and so forth, rather than a really expensive cruise missile. Then you are arguably stopping, say, 50 or 30 vehicles returning to the front line. And that's actually really, really significant. In fact, I think you could probably justify a cruise missile hit on this place. Maybe. I don't know. I would need to know a bit more information, to be honest. Anyway, there are at least 2 solutions to this issue: the long range loitering munitions and the deployment of GLSDB. So those are ground launched small diameter bombs. These are small diameter bombs, dumb munitions that, a bit like JDAMs, that are adjusted, given guidance systems and dropped from planes with fins that allow them to glide, so they're not just dropping straight down. You get a bit of forward momentum. They're going to drop sort of, I guess, diagonally, aren't they? But if you get enough height and forward momentum and you put wings on them, then they can go even further. So the range is increased, and then you can get them to home in on a target. Kind of, they have some kind of accuracy, precision there. With GLSDB, you are doing the same kind of thing. You're taking a dumb munition and you're adjusting it, and you're enabling it to be fired out of a HIMARS rocket system, a guided multiple launch rocket system. So these are then able to reach possibly further than the normal HIMARS rocket as well. They're relatively cheap, range that surpasses that of GIMLRs, so it surpasses what HIMARS is presently able to do, other than ATACMS, of course. Equipped with a sufficiently large payload to inflict serious damage. In my view, both these solutions will be pivotal. That's long-range loitering munitions, so those are going to be drones that can go a long distance with good payloads. So in my view, both these solutions, the drones and the GLSDB will be pivotal in 2024. Delivery of GLSDB is expected in autumn, and local production needs time to ramp up. So local production, that is for, I presume, not just for GLSDB, or they aren't produced locally. So they're talking about those loitering munitions that the Ukrainians are apparently creating some really cheap cruise missile, Trembita they're called, sort of cruise missiles that are using the same kind of technology as the sort of V1s or whatever in World War II, using jet propulsion to get them from A to B. And some of them will have serious payloads on, some of them, or fairly serious. Some of them won't have payloads on, but be used as kind of decoys. Yes, they need to produce. If that's what they're talking about, they're actually, to be honest, there are so many options that the Ukrainians are looking into in building. Those Trembita ones are ones that volunteers are seeking to put together, but there'll be ones that the Ukrainians are manufacturing to scale, but using their industrial military complex. Anyway, I digress. I believe ally support in production could be mutually beneficial, particularly within the future sales of a loitering munition. And I think that is really important. So that is that trade-off between expensive precision, big payload, but would you take out targets like this, and cheap, smaller payload, maybe less effective, maybe less accurate, but if you can fire 10 of them for the price of a cruise missile, then a sort of a Storm Shadow, then hey, jobs are good. Right, let's move on to this. This is Brian Ivy. Thanks for this, Brian. This is loads of stuff to talk about in this comment. Although I completely disagree with the Ukrainian skeptics in the US, I've talked about this a lot recently, and in fact, there's just more footage. I'm going to share with you a little bit more Ramaswamy footage later, just because there's some really interesting talking points. And actually, I'm going to really big up Brian Kilmeade from Fox News, which is something I thought I would never do in my life. But anyway, there you go. The following logic was expressed by several friends as their reason for the caution about supporting Ukraine. Here's their talking point. So this is important because for example, he knows people that are saying this stuff. And if you know people that are saying this stuff, let's talk about this to give ammunition for repelling those verbal attacks, if you like, or verbal defenses, actually. So, one, Ukraine is a product of the USSR and will always have a culture of corruption and a culture that invites a strong man in power. Okay, let's deal with that first of all. This is to say they're corrupt once, they'll always be corrupt, which is to say no nation has moved from corrupt to non-corrupt. I mean, this is obviously ridiculous. The US military was corrupt once, and it is now not corrupt. They took them decades to overcome corruption in the US military, as far as I was told recently, in terms of procurement and all sorts of stuff. I think maybe going from the Second World War onwards, maybe Vietnam onwards. I don't know the exact details of that, but the idea is that institutions, countries, people can change, right? And it can take effort. It might take a bit of time. It might take decades, but it can be done. This kind of approach is really pessimistic. It's really fatalistic, and it's to say that you know there is this essence. There's an essentialism here in philosophy. It's this idea that there is an essence to Ukrainianism, right? That that they have and that they can never get away from. It's just in their DNA. It's in their DNA to be corrupt. And I hear this kind of speak about like Russian people, and sometimes I challenge that. It's like, the Russians, it's lying or corruption or whatever. It's in their DNA, and I don't think that's true. It's just culturally embedded, really, really deeply, and that takes generational shifts to get rid of. And the same here, but this shift has already started taking place, right? You've got to understand that from 1991 onwards, like Russia, the former USSR states, or whatever you want to call them, were dabbled with capitalism, dabbled with democracy, right? In terms of Russia, the Russian Federation, it kind of failed, right? And this is where we're at. We've got Putin, the world's richest human being, an autocrat and a kleptocrat in charge of a failed democracy. And you look at the transparency index, and Russia are way down the list, right? So they are a failed democratic project. Ukraine, on the other hand, are not failed. They're in a hybrid state at the moment. If you look at definitions, I think this might be a transparency index definition of their democracy. It's a hybrid democracy, which means they're really trying hard to get to a fully fledged democracy, but they do have issues with corruption, but they're doing stuff about it. Zelensky's just sacked all of the recruitment leaders, the local recruitment heads of recruitment around Ukraine due to corruption. So it's like you wouldn't do that if you weren't on this journey out of corruption. So this is just a really bad argument. Number two, democracy has no place in Ukrainian tradition and will not survive. This is again ridiculous, right? Where does tradition come from? It comes from just stuff that you do over a long period of time. Like, oh, we traditionally do that. Yeah, but at some point you started doing that, didn't you? Like as a nation, as a family, as an organization, as a whatever. Like a tradition is born out of just stuff you do for a long period of time. But it's like you didn't always do that. Right? It wasn't at some point that kind of behavior was you first did that, right? And it became a tradition because you did it a lot. In other words, democracy becomes a tradition if you do it a lot. So you might say now democracy is an American tradition. Yeah, but originally they were part of the British Empire and part of a monarchy, right? Do you know what I mean? So, and then they wrote the Constitution, and that became a kind of like scapegoat tradition. Yeah, it's linked back to point number one here. It's like you're just saying that you can't change. That's what you do. It's your tradition, and that's it. I mean, it has no place. I know he may be like these are his words interpreting what they're saying. So things might get lost in translation. But democracy has no place in Ukrainian tradition. Is just absolutely ridiculous and will not survive. Again, fatalistic. I mean, it won't survive if we allow Russia to do. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, well, if you think that you're going to support Russia or not support Ukraine and allow Russia to do what they're doing, and then it won't survive. And then you go, yeah, I told you it wouldn't survive. Democracy won't survive. Yeah, because you disallowed it to survive. You had the power, or America or allies have the power to allow democracy to thrive in Ukraine. Ukrainians want democracy to thrive. So what's really interesting here is that part of why Russia has, I mean, go and listen to people like Timothy Snyder, listen to lots of people who have done a lot of work on it, on the history of this whole area, the history of Ukraine, the political situation of Ukraine, and what apparently Russia were afraid of is having a functioning democracy on their doorstep. Putin didn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO, yeah, but didn't, because he wanted that buffer zone. He didn't want NATO on his doorstep, but he didn't want, I think almost more importantly, didn't want a functioning democracy. So Ukraine had succeeded. So if you go and read something like The Gates of Europe, like read a history, what I'd say to these people, and of course they're never going to do this, if they're like not interested in supporting Ukraine, they're not going to be interested in reading a history book on Ukraine. But go and read some books on Ukraine and understand where Ukraine went after the 1990s and where Russia went. And it went in two really different directions. And yes, Ukraine is still on that journey and it hasn't got there to that destination yet, but it's in a very different place to Russia. So to say that democracy is not in Ukrainian tradition, it is just nonsensical. And say it will not survive. Well, it is surviving at the moment. It's surviving. It's hanging on. With its fingernails are clasping to democracy and to a future that is attractive. It's hanging on because Russia are attacking it because they don't want that. They don't want the grass is greener for their own population. So look at Ukraine and say, oh, look at the average wages. Look at the all these indicators of well-being that Ukraine have. Look at the IT savviness of this population and the employability, and look at etc. And he doesn't want that. He wants Ukraine to fail so that it's not attractive to his own population, so that the grass isn't greener. Yeah, just a real big problem with this. Okay, point number 3. Any ultra-modern kit supplied will eventually end up in hands of a Ukrainian tyrant. Okay, before I go on, like this is just presupposing. Again, this is like a big circular argument. You're assuming what you want to prove. If you're going to start with there's going to be a Ukrainian tyrant, like my right, imagine the war wasn't happening and you just had Zelensky in charge now. I wouldn't look at Ukraine and go, God, the next ruler is going to be a tyrant. Why would I think that? We've got a peaceful democratic nation. We've got Zelensky being voted in, and you would assume the next person in charge of Ukraine would be voted in. You'd have a peaceful exchange of power. Why would the next guy be a tyrant? Why would you say that? Any ultra modern kit supplied will eventually end up in the hands of a Ukrainian tyrant and most likely will align with other tyrants in the world in the future. It's just nonsense. If you're going to, like, okay, if you think that, where's your justification for that? Will it, are you saying, well, it happened in Afghanistan, then it's a false equivalence? We saw that from Ramaswamy saying that exactly that kind of stuff. So this is why someone like this, not Brian Ivey, but who Brian Ivey is talking about here, someone like this is sucking up the stuff that Ramaswamy and people like that are saying, which is like, there's an equivalence between Ukraine and Afghanistan. Look what happened in Afghanistan. Taliban have got all these bits of kit now because the US got out really quickly and it all fell apart. And what was left was a government that was unable to stand on its own 2 feet. And so all that help that we gave went nowhere, and all that kit ended up with the Taliban. So, and that's what happened with Ukraine. It's like, no, it won't. It's a complete false equivalence. There are no warlords in Ukraine and bands of like theocratic tribes X, Y, and Z. It's just a complete false equivalence. And so, yeah, those 3 points are just non-starters. And I would absolutely love to get into a conversation with someone who is espousing those points. But the problem is there's an awful lot of psychology involved, and you start having arguments with people like that, and then they have what's called the backfire effect. So they entrench in their original position even more strongly because no one likes changing their mind. I've talked so often about cognitive dissonance reduction and all these psychological heuristics that act when we just on a daily basis. We have them when we deal with stuff that we don't like or is against our core beliefs, evidence against a position that we've taken, so on and so forth. It's what we all do. But quite often someone who feels very strongly about these 3 points is unlikely to be put straight on those 3 points, and they go, "Oh, you're absolutely right. I need to change my mind." What ends up is you just put the wall up. You stay in your original position, you kind of bury your head in the sand, and you get even stronger in that position and shout even louder. The interesting thing about the line of reasoning is a complete lack of faith in the basic institutions of Ukraine. Absolutely, to foster a sustained democratic culture without corruption. It's not isolationist. It's a true belief anything invested in Ukraine is in the long term useless and potentially dangerous. I found it difficult to debate this entrenched belief. How do you argue a leap of faith? It is really difficult. I mean, it's just because so there's a great adage that I use really often. It's you can't rationally argue someone out of a position they never rationally argued themselves into. So they didn't take up that position through a really good rational evaluation of what's going on. Often people take up things that they just heard and they say it or that their parents believed. So if you're talking about religions or something like that, and you're trying to argue with someone who's a Muslim from Riyadh, right? And you're like, I'm arguing you rationally, and I'll defeat all your theological arguments. For example, it's just an example, but I defeat all your theological arguments. But actually, often that person won't have arrived at being a Muslim from rational evaluation. Why are you Muslim? Well, because my parents are, and I live in Riyadh, and everyone is. And if I'm not, I'm in trouble. And so, therefore, for thinking I can solve that issue with rational arguments is a problem. You arrived at that psychologically and societally and socially and familially and so on and so forth. And I need to understand why you've arrived at that conclusion in order to disabuse you of that position. And just doing it with rational argumentation, unfortunately, and this is so sad as a philosopher, unfortunately, generally won't do it. There's very few people that go, "Oh, you've got me. You're absolutely right. I'm going to change my mind now because those are really good rational arguments." So, how do you argue against people like this? It's very difficult, and it's quite often it's drip feeding. So, Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, talks about changing people's mind. Imagine they're on top of an elephant, like they're riding an elephant, and what you need is someone who's riding along basically in the same direction as them, someone in their in group, right? Rather than, so if you're talking about Muslim, what if you're a really fundamentalist Muslim, right? What you'd want, instead of someone who's like an atheist philosopher, go, yeah, you shouldn't believe that, which is like that. What you want is someone in their in group, but maybe like a slightly more liberal Muslim, to just nudge them, going in the same direction on the elephant, riding the elephant. You just nudge that, and then someone else can take over. That then becomes in their new in group, as they've nudged themselves out of that in group into this kind of more liberal Muslim, and it's they get nudged, and that is a healthy way to change someone's mind. Is you do it gradually over time, and then eventually, after some years, they're in a completely different position than they were. I'm not picking on Islam or whatever here, but I'm just using an example. So if you want to disabuse someone of a position, what never basically happens, very rarely, is that you get this position and someone coming butting up against that position, saying you're completely wrong, and then this person going, oh yeah, completely wrong, and doing a 180 shift and going in the other direction. That just never, like elephants butting, and then one elephant just completely turning, and then they're both going in the same direction. If that does happen, quite often, so I've seen this in arguing in the sphere of religion. So sometimes you get like militant atheists, right? They're not militant, but you know what I mean, like who become really evangelical because they have converted from really strong religious belief, and they've done that 180 shift, and then they become really strong atheists, and it's almost like evangelical atheists, and they are. It's almost like they are just as militant in their beliefs as they had before, just in the other direction. That kind of 180 shift can happen. It's quite rare, but it often means that you're the similar sort of non-believer that you were as a believer. And so you can look at that in different contexts, like politics, war. This is kind of war and politics and everything. And you could imagine they might do a 180 shift, but it'd be really unlikely. And the best thing is to just nudge them, get them to change their mind on maybe one little bit, and then a week later it's work on something. Do you know what I mean? It's just nudging them, and then sometimes just dropping seeds of doubt, and also another good tactic. I'm getting onto like how to change people's minds here, aren't I? Another one is Socratic dialectic, which is like asking questions rather than just coming up with arguments against them. Socrates used to win arguments by just asking questions, and there'd be such good leading questions lead the person to realize in their own mind that they were wrong. And this is what coaching does, like in modern kind of professional life. If you do coaching, many jobs, many careers and organizations take on coaching as a way to, I don't know, improve whatever. You can have life coaches and whatever, but a lot of the basis of coaching is Socratic dialectic, which is, getting the person to release their own understanding of what problems they have and how they can improve, rather than someone saying you need to improve by doing this. You're saying, what would happen to this, and you're getting and just question, and then eventually you release your own understanding. That's the theory, right? So with someone like this, maybe it's those kind of approaches, but it's really difficult changing people's minds. Sorry, this is a lot of me just going off on one. Right, let's stay on target, Pierce. Stay on target. Right, here we have a completely different subject. A 20-year-old Kirill from Luhansk. He lived in the occupation from 11 to 19 years. Despite the constant Russian propaganda, on February 22nd, the guy left Luhansk for Kharkiv. At the beginning of March of 2022, he joined the territorial defense. Now he is a platoon commander of the 225th Separate Assault Battalion, storming the positions of Russians near Bakhmut. His father is still living in Luhansk, and he has relatives who are fighting against him in the ranks of the Russian army. That's just absolutely incredible. But it does give you hope that, people that you might think might be brainwashed within the occupied territories do actually have some understanding of what's going on, and given the opportunity, would not be, supporting and fighting for the Russians. Kenneth Gregg, again, he's the fighter he's a Finnish fighter in Ukraine. That is, I don't know quite what he's doing now, but I thought this was from yesterday. I meant to share it yesterday, but didn't get around to it. It's worth dwelling on some of this. A lot has happened that shows that the war is largely won by us. So obviously, very positive view here. If Western aid continues to flow in, we have shown that our missiles, including Neptune, are well designed and effective. First, we knocked out the missile cruiser Moskva at sea, and now we knocked out an important radar installation belonging to the S-400 Russian air defense system that controls the entire western part of the Black Sea. An armada of 6 other rockets knocked out the feeder, control units, and launchers. This is interesting. So I haven't. He's now given me some information that is adding to what we know. So what do we know? Is that S-400 system? If you remember, I'll try and find the details of it that will remind you of the video. So this is a system in Crimea. If you remember, it was out on the western edge of Crimea, northwestern Crimea, and it was taken out by HIMARS. And we've got the claim from the Ukrainians was the entire battery and the entire crew were taken out. The video evidence we have is that there is one big explosion that takes out at least the erector launchers. So people are unsure, whether the whole system was taken out or whether this is overblown by the Ukrainians or whatever. But Kenneth Gregg here is saying an armada of 6 other rockets knocked out the feeder, the control units, and launchers. Of course, we might not have visual evidence of that, but there's nothing to suggest it didn't happen. In fact, if I was the Ukrainians, I would be sending all that stuff against that S-400. That's a huge, high-value system. Probably one of the most important targets of that you can think of hitting, right? And I would think I would not just want to send one rocket. I would want to take that whole thing out. And he says this means that the entire station is now completely destroyed. This gives us more time before our drones are detected, increasing the likelihood of them hitting their designated targets. We will definitely see the escalation of drone warfare in Crimea, which is exactly what we saw the next night. And I was saying, first of all, there were 2 single drones that went towards Crimea one night and they were taken down. And I was saying, and then reporting from Ukraine said as well, I think, that this is usually what happens when they're trying to find out where air defenses are. You just send a couple of drones and you're like, okay, it turns out that we can track now the S-400 is there, right? And then the next night, and I said, and now you're going to see some more activity next night as they hit some of those targets. What happened? The S-400 was hit, some S-300 was hit in Kherson, blah, blah, blah. So, okay, then it's like now you're going to see some serious activity. And the very next night, you had 42 drones flying into Crimea, and the 126th brigade or whatever was had their barracks hit and whatnot. And there was a lot of damage, I think, probably done. You Russians claim that all 42 were either shot down or electronic warfared out of the sky, but I think reality is somewhat different. Anyway, so he was saying officially the raid is considered to. So at the same time, we had a landing at Mayak by a group of special forces. Officially, the raid is considered to have had only propaganda value, but that is not the whole truth. They also had a special mission that was more than successful. The Russian aircraft sent to counter them was hit and had to return to base. The attack took the Russians by surprise, and they did not initiate countermeasures. The attack shows that we can deploy our troops anywhere in occupied territory, and it shows that the Russians do not have the resources to monitor such large areas. Furthermore, the Russians have moved everything they have right to the contact lines of the fronts because they know that when we reach their trenches from the flanks, it is a fairly simple matter of roll up the miles of contiguous trenches. Having the opponent inside the trench network is pure poison, and the probability of being rolled up is large. This is now happening at Robotna. As already reported by others, we have strengthened the offensive troops in the area. Drone warfare is becoming increasingly important, and one charity organization we work with, he goes on to talk about the importance of that. But anyway, I think that's a really interesting set of observations there. And although it might not be true, still, it is interesting to see some of the details he gives about the taking out that S-400 system. Right, I've done way too much banging on. Let's get on to Trentselenko. This is an important point here by Jay in Kyiv, who writes for the Kyiv Post, I think. My 8-point checklist of things Ukraine had to do for its counteroffensive to be successful is as follows. So this is Trentelenko saying, and he wrote back whenever it was. I don't know when it was, but I think he came up with an 8-point list previously, and now it seems that it has actually been the Ukrainians have been successful in achieving them. So, 1, kill Russian artillery, check. And he then refers back to what Jane Kiev says is Ukraine's months-long program of targeting Russian artillery units is paying off. Russian soldier from 72nd Brigade on Eastern Front says they no longer have artillery support and are being slaughtered in waves, armed only with machine guns against Ukrainian tanks. So, and we've seen on a daily basis, Ukrainian artillery or Russian artillery is being attrited at, if we can believe the general staff, at really substantial levels. Number two, he says, systematically kill Russian armed forces jammers. Check. So this is then referring to the claim Ukraine's defense intelligence officers released a video of the destruction of Russian jammer. And I said to you previously that was it Sursky or one of the Russian Ukrainian commanders saying that their number one target was electronic warfare systems. It really is high on their priority list. And check, he's another bit of evidence here. Capture means the jammers are compromised and will become much less effective. A captured Russian RP-377 UVM-1 jammer. He's referring to that claim that's been visually confirmed. Number 3, kill Russian armed forces surface-to-air missile systems, especially S-400 and S-300s. Check. We've just been talking about that, and there are other systems that have been taken out recently. Some S-300s in Kherson, for example. And check another one here. The footage of a destroyed Russian S-300 battery was geolocated to Kalanchak. So yeah, really successful attrition of the air defense systems too. Number 4, systematic petroleum, oil and lubricants attacks in occupied Ukraine and Russia. Check. Ukraine situation report: drone strike puts Russian fuel depot in Crimea up in smoke. And there's so many of these. And he just arbitrarily picks a couple here. Mortar shelling of a Russian ammo and fuel depot. So on and so forth. And Ukrainian drones striking Russian fuel depot in Feodosia in Crimea. It wasn't just naval drones that struck important targets that morning. There also, so that's just referring to a strike on Feodosia that I reported back when it happened as well. And then point number 5, make southern Ukraine a logistical desert. Kerch Bridge closed, check. And of course, all the stuff to do with the Kerch Bridge. Other Crimean road and rail bridges were hit. Check again for southern Ukrainian logistical desert. And that's storm shadows hitting the Chonhar Bridge, hitting both the rail and the road bridge, Henichesk Bridge as well, so on and so forth. Multiple Crimean ammo depots meet storm shadows. Another check for make a logistical desert. And then with more visual evidence of logistics being absolutely hammered, ammunition depots and whatever, or what have you. Check. And so on and so forth. And now Russian armed forces ammo depots on the retail bases close to the current front lines are being struck in a boom, boom, boom metronome. Check for making southern Ukraine an ammo desert. And this is referring to posts about ammunition depots being hit by Novopokrovka in the Orokhiv sector. So this is all happening on a daily basis. Again, there's only several arbitrarily chosen examples that he needs to put here, because there are plenty more that he could. And number 6, point number 6, an AFU info war campaign causing Russian fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Check. And he refers to P-Star 1-1, saying, appealed by one of the soldiers of the 205th Brigade of the Russian Army, left bank Dnipro. No one dares to inform the higher command. Fear of psychiatric hospital sets in, all according to plans. This was the other day in Kherson when they weren't getting rescued as well, and on these islands in the Dnipro River Delta, and there was all these rumors of the Russian commanders who were complaining about this and being sent to psychiatric hospitals and all sorts. So there is just something rotten in the state of Denmark, I guess, in the Russian armed forces here, that all is not well. And if you, like Popov, if you say it's not well, then you end up being off-skied. So yeah, it's not a good look. And he also says, and check, a Ukrainian fear, uncertainty, and doubt information campaign to fix or divert Russian troops anywhere but where Ukraine wants to attack. That looks like Belgorod Oblast right now. and so, referring to Belgorod being, attacked by the Russian defense, the Russian volunteer corps, so on and so forth, that spreads as well fear and uncertainty amongst the Russians. And then point number 7, seeing lots of Ukrainian combat engineering equipment being used. Check. So that's your Bradleys, that's your mine clearing vehicles, your Mikliks, and so on and so forth, being used effectively. Check. Ukrainian sappers clearing mines. Check. And here we have Ukrainian sappers using new tactics to clear mines, such as drones being able to tell whether the mines are there because they haven't cooled down as much as the earth around them in the early evening. So you can detect them using thermal imagery and then do something about them. So, and his last point, 8, Russian complaints of Ukrainian drone swarms. Check. And I told you this morning that some Russian sources were saying that the sky is black with drones. Russia says repelled a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack on Crimea. So there are two different things going on here. There's your large drones, like the 42 drones that attacked Crimea, that I've just been talking about, and then you have your smaller drones dropping IEDs, doing recon, spotting for artillery, that are all up in the air. Both of those are relevant there. Check. Russia says it shot down 73 drones over the last 24 hours. That was on the 25th of August. And check. Russia reports a mass Ukrainian kamikaze drone use in what is one of my markers for an AFU breakthrough attempt. Trentelenko said on the 24th. And now in this thread, he's saying that I've checked all these things. This is all a sign of success. We shall see if this is the usual Russian propagandist BS or pretends to something more militarily substantial. So he finishes by saying, all 8 items on my checklist of things the Ukrainians had to do in a successful counterattack have been ticked off in terms of social media reports. We shall see in the coming weeks if those were reliable reports and if it was indeed a good checklist. I'd say that is a pretty useful checklist, and I think those things are happening. And I think, things are looking good in many respects for the Ukrainians. All the caveats, of course, apply there. I'm going to go back to here. I'll probably talk about the rest tomorrow. Again, I keep putting stuff off till tomorrow. Happens all the time. This is going back to Ramaswamy. I know he's not going to get voted in, right? I know that. I know he's not going to be the Republican candidate. This is obvious, but it goes back to what Brian was saying earlier, which is I know plenty of people who believe this, right? And what he sets out there is exactly what Ramaswamy is communicating. And when he's given oxygen of Fox News or any other platform, like a debate, to say that, then that's a problem because a lot of people listen. However, the great thing here is Brian Kilmeade actually does a really good job of putting Ramaswamy in his place here. Because basically, as the quote that's lifted here by Aaron Rupar says, we can actually, this is what Ramaswamy said, we can actually go in the other direction, reopen economic relations with Russia, freeze the current lines of control. Kilmeade said, what, so let Russia take 20% of the country? This is worth listening to, even if you don't have any time for this guy. He is reflective of a certain view that you see around the world, actually. It's not just in the US.
But what I've said is we can actually go the other direction. Reopen economic relations with Russia. Freeze the current lines of control. Make a commitment that NATO will not admit Ukraine to NATO.
So let Russia take 20% of the country.
It's brilliant. It's like, so you want to go in a different direction and freeze the conflict. So Russia have just invaded, and you're cool with Russia invading and taking 20% of the country. Would that be okay in America? Say, okay, stop now, time for peace, let's do that. You can have the 20% of America as long as we just have peace now. Like, you would never accept that in America. Why would you accept that in a sovereign state outside of America? It's just absolutely insane. And Kilmeade calls it out.
They took it. They just took it.
The reality,
and you said we let him have it.
What do we get in return?
But listen,
the reality is
that would, oh my God, if you're Ukrainian and you're watching that, you would want to punch him in the face. Like, the question is, what do we get in return? Like, he's not talking about Ukraine here. It's now the US. Hey, you can have 20% of Ukraine. You can have 20% of any country in the world. What do we get in return? As long as we get something in return, then that's cool. You want to murder people and grape them and this and that. Yeah, that's fine. As long as we get something in return, it's not a problem. You want to You want to completely invade a democratic sovereign state? No problem.
What do we get in return? I'm keeping my eyes on the prize, Brian. Here's the.
I'm keeping my eyes on the prize. This is so. This is ignoring. It's ignoring Ukraine in this. What about the Ukrainians? It's like watching someone being beaten up on the side of the road and like not getting involved. I'm keeping my eyes on a prize. What do I get out of this? The mugger's taken her handbag off her. Yep. But he's dropped a $5. Right, I'm going in and getting a $5. Keep my eyes on the prize. I'm okay. So what do I get out of this? I get a $5. So it's okay for you to beat that old lady up because I get a $5 out of that. Nice one. Keep my eyes on the prize.
Eye on the prize. The Russia-China alliance is the greatest threat the United States faces. There is not a single candidate in either party who has offered a coherent plan of how to disband that alliance. I have, and I want to use the.
No, you didn't. Your plan was not coherent. Shut up.
Ukraine war as a chance to bring that alliance apart. That will be the single greatest advance.
We're watching the Russian army deconstructed before our eyes. We're watching the Russian army deconstructed before our eyes without any American blood. They are the aggressors, and our foreign policy did win us the Cold War, which.
Kilmeade is slaying here. I mean, this is absolutely right. This is good man, and I'd never say that.
I assume you know.
Otherwise.
Yes, in the modern Cold War, Brian, that the old establishment needs to wake up and see is that the USSR doesn't exist anymore, but communist China does. But what I've
so he's basically wants the Ukraine war to be a tool to use to leverage China, and you know we can debate that, but it's not a sound plan at all. Anyway, you are starting to see these kind of arguments now on national television in America. Let's hope it doesn't spread to other countries. And well, I say that to places like UK, but we don't kind of have that. We've got really strong bipartisan support in the UK, and actually this was commented on. I think Ukraine, the latest podcast, talked about this last couple of days. So actually, we don't have that sort of issue to worry about. But there are countries around the world where Marine Le Pen in France, I'm sure, will be she's bankrolled by the Russians. Other nations in Europe, of course, where you will be hearing lots of these arguments, and it's just knowing that what the answers are to these arguments, and that they are just really bad geopolitical arguments. Anyway, that's my tuppence for today. Plenty enough, I think, because that's a good 40-odd minutes of me banging on. So much more to say. Anyway, thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate all of you. You're brilliant. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.